a devil literally visited her house. She wakes up and she goes and she sees at the bottom of the stairs like this big, dark, devilish figure just wandering around her house. And she is like completely terrified because the devil, of course, kind of insinuates that, like, the way she's been living hasn't been right. She has been kind of eyes closed to like the reality of her situation. So it's a way of kind of shocking her into like changing her situation, but also trying to change the difficult situation of people immediately around her. There is something inherently like terrifying about seeing the truth in the world for what it really is. Like, to be a visionary is to have this deep kind of responsibility for kind of wanting to see the horrors before you can improve them, to see the terror and the reality of the world before you can kind of prophesize a better one, or else kind of prophesize a worse one if things continue the way they are.
Solomon and Smith. Welcome to Solomon and Smith. You said go for it. I'll do it again. Welcome to Solomon and Smith. You're in the right place, bucko. I mean, we need like some sort of catchphrase. Keep it juicy, large boys.
Keep it juicy, large boys. Great. You're about to watch an interview with Jodie Marley and myself and Jack regarding William Blake. You've heard something like that before. We've already spoken about William Blake with a different person, Mark Vernon. We've characterized Mark Vernon as a representative of innocence. Jodie is a representative of experience. This is a Blakean contrary unfolding before your eyes. So this is the second of two. This is the complete set. You've seen them all if you're here. If you haven't seen part one, making a big mistake.
If you like what me and Milo are doing here, you can support us with gold bars, bullion, gemstones, rare earth rocks down on the Patreon link below. Like and subscribe this... No. Like and subscribe. It's helpful. It's a helpful move. And without any further ado, here's Jodie Marley.
Jodie Marley, everyone.
Woo!
Bring her in.
Great to see you, Jodie. What are you drinking?
Decaf. I had caffeine already, so I need to like stagger it. So just decaf Yorkshire. Yeah.
Decaf Yorkshire. That's me. That's a description of my soul. Jodie pulled a tarot card this morning, the Ace of Pentacles. Is it called the Pentacles?
Yeah. So it's like a coin in a hand, and it's like the start of the suit. So yeah, it corresponds to like if you have playing cards, like an ace there, but it's like beginnings because it's the first in the suit. Yeah, so something new.
Tarotguide.com says financial new beginnings, new financial opportunities. New job, new business, money, investments, savings, prosperity. Whoa.
This is what it's all about, really. This is the point of it all.
Yeah.
But this presumably only applies to you and not to the Solomon and Smith podcast.
Well, like it's a collaboration, right? And like maybe you'll bring in some more like Patreon subscribers and other places. Yeah. No.
Inexplicably, all the money goes to you, though. No, how?
Wizardry at work.
I'm just looking for the poetic epigraph for this episode.
Yeah.
Which is Isaiah 6, but I need to find it. I'm apologies, all I have is ESV. You can cover your ears if too much,
okay.
But I've just got only ESV on tap at the moment. Where are you, Isaiah?
I love that you do this with all your guests. Like you kind of choose them. So I'm like, what are they going to choose? And of course you chose the prophets.
Yeah, the best prophet.
Yes.
And I'm fairly convinced that this stuff is the oldest stuff in the Bible. So
okay.
Yeah, there's like a pretty good case to be made that the Isaiah origin story in Isaiah 6 is the oldest bit of text in here.
Ah,
Anyway, here we go. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and whom will go for us? Then I said, Here I am, send me. And he said, Go and say this to my people.
that's beautiful. Yeah.
Going to hand over to Milo now, because Isaiah comes up in the marriage of heaven and hell. Blake has a conversation with him, and
He
there's
does.
quite a different origin story.
He does indeed show up, and they say some interesting things to one another. Blake's general drift seems to be something like, how do you know this was prophecy? How do you know what
Yes.
you've written is good? And there's a nice little bit where he asks, you got any other good stuff? And Isaiah says, no, this is this is pretty much it, but it's worth it.
Oh,
And I suppose the question and reflection is, because obviously Blake sort of primes himself in this prophetic mode.
yes.
Is Blake essentially saying that it's the sort of aesthetic quality of the work by which you can judge its the prophecy quality, its truth?
Yeah, so there's 2 kind of aspects to my answer of that question. Like the first being Blake is very much priming his work, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and other prophetic pieces, as within the tradition of both biblical prophecy, but also millenarian 18th century prophecy. And one way to do that, to kind of validate your prophecy, is to kind of speak in this particular mode. With Blake, Isaiah is literally appearing to him, and they're having a conversation, and they're having it in his house as well, which is very intimate and very personal. And so it reflects kind of two kind of traditions Blake is in that it's like a much older one, but also something that's very contemporary to him as well. Yeah.
What
And when
is
you get
millenarianism? Just to explain that term, because
Yeah,
I'm
of
kind of
course, of
unfamiliar, only
course.
in a broad sense.
Yes, so in the late 18th century and into the very early 19th century, um, there were a lot of different kind of religious groups and sects and like kind of alternative Christianities, alternative spiritualities, that brought forth kind of like revelatory things. And it's deeply kind of political at the time. It's quite controversial. So there was this guy called Richard Brothers, who was a prophet who was actually imprisoned for prophesying against like the king, against a political order. And he was called mad by authority, by the government. He was imprisoned in like a mental institution. So like this prophecy had political power in that like it could like kind of allegedly kind of make and break kings and royalty and like people with great power, which is why so many women prophets were controversial at the time, like Joanna Southcott, who I write about a lot. She wasn't imprisoned, but she was. All her detractors called her mad, basically. So, like to summarize, like millenarianism is a specific like evolution of religious like sects and religious culture at the time. It is very localized in this like late 18th century into like the first decade of the 19th century kind of era.
Is it a term
Um,
people are using to describe themselves, or is it mostly just a catch-all term for a very diverse
it's
set of people?
it's generally like a catch-all term that has been applied by scholars of like religion and religious literature. Someone like, John Mee or Oriane Smith, both of them kind of are good like writers and critics to get to know more about that era and the people that were writing then. But it's like a term that's applied later, completely different. But something like how like romanticism was applied much later by
Yeah,
scholars.
and it's the
It's like
same
a
period as well.
label.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
is there an etymology to it? Millenarian, something to do with 1000?
So like I'm trying to remember my own kind of like reading here, but I believe, and I welcome correction on this and like disclaimers and things, but I believe it is like the new millennium. So like they're prophesizing a new millennium, a new world. And that of course like comes into Blake as well because he is like kind of prophesizing like new worlds, new things. Like he is prophesizing things that did and didn't happen. And he is influenced by this tradition in that he references Joanna Southcott in like a poem in his notebook, and then Crab Robinson, who wrote these diary entries in the 1830s and 1820s, I think, that describe his conversations with Blake, and there's a reference to Joanna Southcott there as well. So there's documentary evidence that Blake like, engaged with this. And while someone like Swedenborg wasn't necessarily a millenarian, Jacob Boehmer wasn't necessarily either. They were both very popular within those religious movements because of their visionary and like prophetic and unusual qualities. Yeah.
Mhm.
And while we've got Marriage in Heaven and Hell and the two modes, prophetic
Mm,
mode and millenarian mode, there's a
mm,
third mode sometimes people associate with it. And with any Blake text, you get X number of interpretations. And often to support the project of the interpreter, what is Blake
mm,
saying? You get this
mm,
sometimes with innocence and experience. Some have said that innocence is in fact satirical to justify experience. I don't think that
mm.
adds up, but it's a claim that's made, and a similar claim for Marriage of Heaven and Hell that it is also satirical. This is a satire on
Yes.
Swedenborg's similar work, and
Mm,
how seriously should we take it? In my mind, it seems more like it's a provocative mode rather than that
yes.
all of the text is ludicrous, rather that he's simply using different vocabulary to state standard sort of Blakean theory that will come up again and again. But
Mm.
as to the idea that it may be satire, that you have people who think perhaps this is a comic rather than a serious work, what do you think of that?
So there is definitely a satirical element there. Blake is criticizing Swedenborg for his almost kind of his very dogmatic approach to things that are very kind of strange and off the wall. So with Blake, and particularly with my work on Blake, a lot of Blake critics will try and define Blake, will try and fit Blake into a system of binaries or like one religious system or one kind of way of approaching it. Like the Marriage of Heaven and Hell is like a perfect example of Blake mashing together all these different modes and like kind of reflecting all these different elements of like you've got the prophecy, you've got him talking to Isaiah, and then you've got a criticism of Swedenborg, and it's like the criticism itself is, well, Swedenborg actually doesn't say anything that new to us. He doesn't say anything that other people haven't said before. That whole passage, it starts with Swedenborg, and he's like, well, if you read Paracelsus and Jacob Boehmer, they've said something similar. If you read Dante and Shakespeare, they've said similar things as well. So it's then immediately, it's kind of taking Swedenborg and saying he's not the prophet, he is not one thing, like he is not the guy. There's a whole kind of there's a whole group of people from different backgrounds, different traditions, all kind of saying similar things. And what's key about that is Blake brings artists and writers into that tradition. So, like Dante and Shakespeare, there's visionary elements of their work. I am not a Shakespeare scholar by any means. I've done a bit more work on Dante, but Dante, like Blake in Marriage of Heaven and Hell, travels to hell as well as to heaven. And he has this like visionary quality, but it is applied to both like a literary and the Divine Comedy is very political as well, very grounded in Dante's political time. So like there are definite satirical elements to it. Blake was not wholeheartedly accepting Swedenborg, but it's just one of many, many influences within that poem. And that's what makes it so kind of rich and interesting, because the form of the poem changes. In fact, like the word poem is maybe like too small to contain what is in that. You've got the proverbs of hell, you've got like prose passages. It's like a massive like hybrid work, really.
And aphorisms as well. It almost feels like
Yes.
going through a library of some small sect who had a very strange collection of writings written by various
Yeah.
different authors. It's so
And
diverse, and it also has this beautiful unfinished quality. Whenever I read Marriage of Heaven and Hell, a part of you wants to finish it off as if it's an
oh,
invitation to continue the same project in a way.
yeah. How would you finish it then? What are you drawn to
A happy
finish within it?
ending, a wedding.
Okay.
I don't know.
And they all lived.
Happily
But
ever
I think it's
after.
in. There you go, finishing each
Mm,
other's sentences.
No,
But I
I
think it's
go on.
interesting, and you mentioned it, that Swedenborg is mentioned in what is sometimes described as a satire on Swedenborg, which strikes me as unusual. If it was an entirely satirical work in a different voice, you wouldn't then break the voice and say, by the way, Swedenborg, the guy I'm criticizing, is not ideal for these reasons. It wouldn't make
mm,
sense if the whole thing was ironic in some way to then immediate. I
yeah.
mean, maybe Blake, we shouldn't look for Blake for complete formal consistency. But I think
No.
that it throws a spanner in those works if this is what we want to get out of it. But I'm curious. Swedenborg did write a work called Heaven and Hell, I believe.
Yes.
Is
Yes, it
is there
is.
any sort of similarity between that and this in particular, or is it more sort of broad? Swedenborg isn't quite on the money.
So I would say of all of Swedenborg's works, I want to say Marriage of Heaven and Hell. That's not it because they're so similar. Like even the title of Marriage in Heaven and Hell is Swedenborgian, but I believe it's called Heaven and Hell from Things Heard and Seen, which immediately places it as a visionary work, and it is in my opinion, Swedenborg's most visionary work of like the four books of his I've read for Blake stuff and other things. So in that book, Swedenborg travels to, he speaks to angels, and that's Blake's criticism. Well, you spoke to angels, but the angels tell him about heaven and hell and purgatory. So the book is roughly kind of split into these three different like sections, like heaven, hell, and purgatory. And so it describes how one gets to heaven, hell, or purgatory, like after you die. It explains kind of the orders of angels and how like heaven and hell appear and manifest on earth. So like how good works or bad works kind of flow. It's like this. Oh my gosh, I'm trying to work out how I would describe this. So I don't know how familiar you are with like the occult like system of correspondences. So say like the Ace of Pentacles, for example, corresponds to the element of earth. So therefore it corresponds to earthly things, therefore money, finances, practical matters. Whereas
Okay.
something like the Suit of Cups would refer to water, emotional, artistic expression. So like there are specific things on earth that correspond to things in heaven. There are certain things in on earth that correspond to things in hell, certain behaviors, certain attributes. And it's a little bit predestinarian in that way because it's like, okay, so you are going to be destined to hell, or like you've already like kind of activated this energy that is already kind of flowing between it. Like it creates like a psychic link between yourself and hell if you kind of sin, or like if you do good works, then heaven. But it's Blake's main criticism is, well, you only listened to angels when you talked about hell. You didn't listen to anyone from hell. And he spent more time with angels. And you kind of see that in Swedenborg's work as well. And it is quite like traditionally moralistic in that like good things are heavenly, bad things are hellish. Whereas Blake completely inverts that in Marriage in Heaven and Hell, where it says like evil is energy, good is reason, etc., near the start. Yeah. So it is deeply like the work itself is deeply kind of Swedenborgian in like its conception of the universe, but then it completely inverts and subverts those values because I think Blake is very playful. Like a lot of people don't like, I don't know. It really depends who you ask, but I find Blake's kind of playful, like jokey, like kind of experimental qualities are really downplayed. And I think marriage is a key kind of a key way to explore Blake in and that aspect to his work. Yeah.
Yeah, and the sort of Swedenborg relationship with Blake, as far as I understand it, it's
Mhm.
not sort of linear. It's not a
No.
straight line. In Jerusalem, you see him sort of referring to a biblical canon that seems to match up with Swedenborg's, despite in that same work also sort of dissing him again a little bit. So, and I
Yeah.
remember a story where he was sort of into the Swedenborg idea. Some friends of his take him to a Swedenborgian church. He sees above the
Yes.
door it says "Thou shalt not." Immediately turns around, not interested. But clearly, there's a push and a pull. There's something in
Mm.
Swedenborg that does appeal a lot to Blake. And what do you think that is exactly? What is the part of Swedenborg that he can't resist, even though some parts of it clearly are so opposite to his tendency?
Yeah, it's the visionary quality. It's like Swedenborg's like openness to receiving like heavenly and spiritual beings and advice and wisdom. Blake was really into like visionaries and prophets of all kinds, people who could connect with and see and hear God directly. Like Blake's like list of references is huge. You've got everyone from Swedenborg to Saint Teresa to like Southcote to Burma, like all these people, like vastly different traditions, but all they have, the one thing they have in common is connection, direct connection with the divine, which, like you see in Blake's works and his letters, he'll say such and such line or such and such thing appeared to me directly or came to me. He also isn't above criticizing that either, as you opened with, actually, that like, okay, so you said so there's like a anecdote where Blake meets a spirit and Blake's like, okay, so you say you're this, but how do I know you're not a devil? How do I know? Like, prove it to me, show me, kind of. He challenges the very vision that appears before him. And I don't know how familiar you are with Blake's visionary heads, but it's a very famous in Blake's studies. It's a very famous like episode where the painter and astrologer John Varley and Blake are sitting in a room, and spirits of past historical figures appear to Blake, and then he's talking to them, sketching them, and Varley is just fully taken in by these visions. He's like, "What do you see? Like, what are they saying?" And Blake is kind of messing about, and it's sometimes kind of joking with him, like, "Oh, like Richard III, he's over there. Oh, the flea's over there," and he's messing with him a bit, and it's just completely like characteristic of Blake's approach to vision. It is both deeply reverential, but also like irreverent at the same time.
There's a famous sort of distinction in Blake scholarship that I don't quite understand. It seems to originate from Northrop Frye between
Okay.
prophecy and vision, or a prophetic and a visionary. Mark Vernon mentioned it briefly in passing.
Okay.
Is there a difference between these modes? Because it seems to me like they're quite, many visionaries subsequently become prophets. Isaiah, for
Oh,
example, at the very beginning.
so I'm going to be annoying and I'm going to say it depends how each scholar defines it. So because like these terms are thrown about so much in Blake scholarship, every scholar has a slightly different definition of it. I for like simplicity purposes and because of the nature of my work, I gave like the start of my book, for example, I gave quite like clear definitions of each one. It's like, okay, so a prophet is someone who prophesies, someone who predicts something, someone who speaks the truth that comes to them that they see.
Mm.
It might be like kind of telling the truth about something that is happening in the present. So, for example, the visions of the daughters of Albion, Athune is prophesying, she is saying what is happening to her and to the
Yeah.
daughters of Albion, so women. So she is saying, this is the situation with women. It's awful. By my God-given power, I speak on this and I ask you to change it, like,
Mm.
because it will only get worse from here. Visions, I would say, is like anything involving seeing something with like what Blake calls like the spiritual eye. So, like seeing or anticipating something again with like via a spiritual means, via prophecy, so that it's very interconnected. So like prophecy can come from vision, it can come from both like having an intimation of what might happen in the future, but also looking around you and seeing, like honestly seeing the reality of what's around you, like the reality of people suffering around you. So I don't think that prophecy is limited to the future. It can be speaking about the present as well. But the two are very interconnected. I think they are part elements of like the same quality, which is why mysticism, the word in Blake studies, is so interesting to me because again, people apply it as a label to so many different things within Blake. It's become like a catch-all, like a umbrella, which a lot of Blake scholars start to reject because of its lack of specificity in the mid like 20th century, as you see with Northrop Frye. And so like still people call Blake a mystic and they call him a visionary and they call him a prophet within and outside of scholarship. And it's just so interesting to me that these words become so interchangeable and like why that is and what aspects of that it's aspects of Blake they're coming onto. So it's very messy and kind of knotty, and it really depends who you talk to. I prefer kind of just in a way to understand Blake, not necessarily to like stress too much that there is a right or a wrong like
Mm.
way to interpret it. But I do think they are all interconnected in a way that you can't understand prophecy without understanding vision. You can't understand mysticism without also understanding like vision either. So it's a really kind of it's a all the boundaries between them are very blurred. Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose especially in sort of the Judeo-Christian tradition, where the
Mm,
visionary often becomes the prophet, whereas in classical analogues, they seem to be separate experiences, or rather,
mm,
having a visionary experience, traveling to the underworld, seeing gods, is something everyone seems able to do. When
mm,
Aeneas or Odysseus goes to the underworld, all the other people on the ship also see everything that he's seeing. It's
mm,
not some special experience because he has a
mm.
mystical, spiritual antennae attuned in a particular way. It's just the gods are there. The gods
Yeah.
are just part of natural reality, whereas the prophets are specialized. The Vestal Virgins, the Sibyls, the Oracle at Delphi in the Aeneid, she seems to have needed to go through some sort of training in order to be
Mm.
this spiritual weather vane to take on the soul of Apollo and speak the voice of Apollo. So yeah, it could just be that that Blake exists more in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's not like there's no classicism whatsoever, but it seems he traces himself more from that stem. Yeah.
Yeah, he does in terms of like a specific tradition, but I would also argue that Blake's like line in again in Marriage about the the doors of perception being cleansed, it implies that everyone has this visionary ability. It's just not everyone is open to it. So it's something that is kind of latent in a lot of people, but not everyone kind of uses it or wants to use it or can face the kind of some of the horrors, frankly. Like I read Fell as a prophecy and it as her rejection of a prophetic like career. So in the book of Thel,
Yeah.
she travels again to an underworld. She talks to her dead body. She sees the dead. She is completely terrified and freaked out by the experience and she runs away. So I see that as like she could have been a visionary. It opened to her. She was terrified and she rejected it for like her own safety and sanity and for similar reasons why Athun suffers and struggles because of the innate difficulties of gender in that time period. So I think that Blake aligns himself with the specific, like Christian prophetic tradition, biblical prophetic tradition, but it's almost New Age the way he kind of thinks of like a prophetic like faculty. Like this is something that actually George Russell A.E. talks about in his book The Candle of Vision, where he's like everyone can be a visionary. You've just got to kind of prepare yourself for it. He encourages meditation and other kind of mental exercises to help you kind of cope with visions and with seeing. Because again, when they come in uninvited, when they come in as like a revelation, they can be quite scary. So George Russell is quite interested in controlling, making them safer, making them easier. If everyone is going to be a visionary, then okay, we need to kind of contain it. And that comes from like his own interest in, I wouldn't necessarily say like engagement with occult secret societies, because he was very against like the Golden Dawn tradition. He was more aligned with theosophy. But again, someone like Yeats did a lot of kind of Golden Dawn like visualizing exercises with say like tarot cards, visual kind of cards to kind of control the vision, have a vision of the specific thing. So it's like Blake advises that like yes, everyone can be a visionary, but you've got to be open to it. And it is similar to this in that like is the people that are later receiving Blake from the occult tradition are like, yes, like you can be a visionary. Here are some steps to do it. So it's similar, but it's different.
Yeah.
There's
It's
an
Yeah.
interesting notion, just to jump in there,
Mm,
with the Book of Thel, and
mm,
maybe it's there in the marriage of heaven and hell, reminds me of the harrowing of hell, where Christ, well, they say in tradition on the cross, visited hell
mm.
before then coming up again. This sense that to experience true vision, one must go to hell in some
Yeah.
respect. One mustn't spend all the time with the angels, but one must go into the underworld and see it. And
Yes.
then the doors are cleansed, innocence through experience and
Mm,
back. And it's interesting too because there's often this sense, even in Blake sometimes, that all one must do to sort of open the doors is really look at a tree and then see the divine glory, and everything is sort of improved by opening the eyes wider. But also
mm,
in Blake, we have this constant notion that the senses were restricted to protect us. You know, the skull is
mm,
this kind of shield, and the eyes are shrunk, and the tongue, because there was this potential of complete chaos with the darkness and the goodness fighting it out. And so really to
mm,
re-expand one's sense, it's not simply just, well, you know, you're in the darkness and go into the light. And it's Platonic, really, the sense that when, you know, you have Plato's cave, you're looking at the shadows, isn't that a good shadow? Wouldn't it be nice to see what was causing the shadow? You climb out the cave, you're blinded by sudden light, and everything is
yeah,
horrible. You run back in, like Thel. I mean, you could see Thel as
exactly.
almost an inverse of Plato's cave, going into the cave, it was
yeah.
dark in it. Ah, run back
Yeah,
out of the cave.
Mm.
So it's the
yeah,
visionary experience requires sort of enduring this unknown, possibly terrifying thing. And only after
exactly.
you've sort of brought it in, you've integrated both contraries, then you kind of get the sight. But I thought that was an interesting thing to bring up because often it's so obviously just just open your eyes, just see the world. It's beautiful. Just come on, guys. What are you waiting for? But it's a
Yeah.
challenge. It's a
Yes, it
challenge for
is.
someone's spirit.
It is because you're seeing the terror as well as the beauty. Um, there's so much in Blake, like so many prophets in Blake just experience and see terrifying things. Like in Blake, people are ripped apart, people kind of like disintegrate, turn into bleeding fountains. They like kind of they split their soul rather than kind of like integrate this vision. And I think it comes from as well, like, visions can be terrifying and people can't quite kind of cope with that. And that kind of brings up again the lives of the real kind of prophets that Blake was drawing from. Someone like Dorothy Gott, for example, who is kind of a lot more obscure than someone like Joanna Southcote, whose works I'm trying to make more like make more mainstream. But like a devil literally visited her house. She wakes up and she goes and she sees the bottom of the stairs, like this big dark devilish figure just wandering around her house. And she is like completely terrified because the devil, of course, kind of insinuates that, like, the way she's been living hasn't been right. She has been kind of, eyes closed to like the reality of her situation. So it's a way of kind of shocking her into like changing her situation, but also trying to change the difficult situation of people immediately around her. There is something inherently like terrifying about seeing the truth in the world for what it really is. Like to be a visionary is to have this deep kind of responsibility for kind of wanting to see the horrors before you can improve them, to see the terror and the reality of the world before you can kind of prophesize a better one, or else kind of prophesize a worse one if things continue the way they are. I didn't write about Simone Weil. I'm not sure it's a German name
Vile.
much, but Weil, yeah, no, she again, she is someone who is very kind of deeply like pessimistic, but also deeply like engaged in the humanitarian kind of nature of the world. It's like all good things come from God. God is love. Um, and like however much we suffer, like we are still human if we have that loving like capacity. Like she is a bit of like how Gen Z would call Simone Weil like a doomer. She is quite pessimistic. Her work is quite pessimistic and like kind of tied to like the inherent suffering it is to be human, but also like the inherent kind of love of experiencing, accepting that suffering. So again, that's not something I wrote about at all. It's just something I saw very connected to these prophets I wrote about, really. Yeah.
Did Dorothy Gott have any sort of more numinous, positive, or inspiring visions, or is she one of these prophets whose entire visionary experience was quite horrifying?
Oh, most of them are horrifying, and it's so funny to me when people do refer to like women prophets in the 18th century, and they refer to like the domestic aspect of their prophecy, and it's like, well, domestic means it's located in the house, and having
Hmm.
demons in your house is awful because that is where you like live. With Dorothy Gott, most of her visions come forth in like physical signs and physical activity, and that like the Holy Spirit or Jesus or Christ physically like enters her body and compels her to move and to do certain actions.
Hmm.
So it is surrendering her body to a spiritual force, trusting that force enough. And
Like the Sibyls
yeah.
in with Apollo in the Aeneid. Just to,
Yes, yes. So taking on again a different kind of another spiritual kind of being. Again, Apollo is an interesting figure to like completely like go off on like a side
yeah.
tangent in that like he's both like a deity of prophecy and also of like art and poetry and song as well, which makes him quite appropriate for Blake. It's
Hmm.
just a side
Yeah.
observation I
Yeah.
wanted to say earlier. Yeah.
Yeah. And Dorothy got, I might have got some, this might be incorrect information, but she experiences most of her visions fairly young in her teens and then writes most of them up later in life. So there's this gestation time to interpret them, categorize them, stew over them. Why do you think it is that we so rarely get an account of a visionary experience right after it happens, the day after it happens? This isn't just in Dorothy
Yeah.
Gott, but also someone like we were talking about Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon with Mark
Yeah.
Vernon, someone like Julian of Norwich as well, who I think
Mm,
had her experiences at like 15 and then wrote them up in her 60s. Um,
mm.
yeah.
So I'm going to correct you slightly in
Yeah.
that, like, both Gott and Southcott admit to having had some visions when they were younger, but the bulk of the visionary experience comes forward when they are older.
Okay.
With Dorothy Gott, it is like a way for her to process and to live with the passing of her husband. Um, and like she tries to convert him on his deathbed. She's like, no, this is something I've been experiencing, but I've been too afraid to acknowledge. So again, it's that fear. I think it's fear and kind of a need to process it because these are very like quite traumatic visions for some of them. There needs to be like this space to kind of when you're in the vision, it's not necessarily that you understand it at the time.
Hmm.
It's like you see a devil, there's a devil in your house, like, oh, there's a devil in my house, not, oh, the devil means that there is something in my house I am not acknowledging. It's like the meaning of it comes later. And sometimes by like kind of articulating the inarticulable or finding a way to kind of put into words what an experience means, that takes longer. I think also younger women are just not taken as seriously. And that might be another aspect to it because like Joanna Southcott, it's funny, she prophesized in middle age and she was kind of ridiculed for her age, so she couldn't really be taken seriously at any like in any era of her life. But
Hmm.
yeah, no, prophecy and vision, it requires time and space to understand it, which is perhaps why the 19th century occultists like tailored these meditative practices to have like short bursts, short doses of vision, so they could kind of have less to work with to understand it like better. Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
interested in a point of comparison.
Mm,
So with Gott and Southcott, the
mm,
assumption is they're sort of writing up what are very real, very literal visions of
mm,
certain objects. But then you get Blake, who does present us with the frame of this. He says, I saw a vision in Lambeth, in Feltham Vale. I saw this and this came to me, and then I wrote it down here, here, or here, which in a way seems to be a sort of generic requirement. He is acting within the frame. But in your view, is this something he actually did see? Did he see the figure of Los come down to his garden
mm.
and inhabit him and then see the Virgin of Ololon? Is this actually him reporting? Or as Mark Vernon supposed, is his vision, as it were, a way of describing imagination and revelation, and that these things are coming to him, and he justifies that as in they're coming from somewhere else? Because I understand, at least with Gott, it wasn't just the notion of a devil entered into her mind.
Mm.
She believed that a devil was in her house at the time.
Yeah,
Do you think
yeah.
Blake believed Los was in his garden, or that the thistle was X deity, or do you think actually it's more of a poetic mode he's taking into, and potentially a little bit of both?
Yeah, I'm going to be a bit annoying and I'm going to say it really depends poem to poem. I think that we can never know with Blake because he sincerely believed in specific visions he had, specific things he saw. Um, there is enough of that in his letters, in his notebook, in his writing that like we know that he believed he experienced visions and communicated with spiritual kind of forces. I think the poetry, the writing, the painting, the songs are like a way to play with that experience, to articulate it, to elaborate on it, to then play off that experience with other people's, to create like a debate, a bigger opening, to go back to Marriage in Heaven and Hell, to compare Blake's quite blunt, direct conversation over the kitchen table with Isaiah and Ezekiel, with his like discussion of Swedenborg, which frames Swedenborg as something much more formalized and Blake's as something closer to home and more like generalized. I think Blake uses he's not directly reporting it. He is turning it into something creative and something new. He has equal to his visionary kind of streak. He's got an artist's streak. And so like his work could be considered divinely like inspired, as he says in various places, but it's never like one, like it's never like 50% vision, 50% art, or 20% vision or 80% art. I think it fluctuates and changes, and it also, that process over the course of his work, from something like Fell, which is very straightforward in a narrative way, to something like Marriage, which is like a pastiche of so many different genres, modes, to something like Milton or Jerusalem, which is far more epic. He is playing with form and playing with art to express visionary and spiritual ideas. I think it's impossible to know, basically, because he plays around so much. I think that's what's so beautiful about him and so interesting about his works, is that he is constantly changing and playing and evolving with it.
According to Yeats, Blake spoke confusedly and obscurely because he spoke of things for whose speaking he could find no models in the world about him. He was a symbolist who had to invent his symbols. What do you think of this reading of Blake as someone like the delay between his visions and the writing of them down is just because he needs to completely invent a whole symbolic language in order to begin to describe them?
I think that's classic Yeats. That's classic Yeats. That's classic, like, this thing must mean this thing. It's very like Golden Dawn occult correspondence's way to write about Blake. I think that,
Could we just
yeah.
go into a little bit about what the Golden Dawn actually are, and maybe compare
Yes,
them to
yes,
the Theosophists? Sort of in
yeah,
my
yeah,
brain,
perfect.
weird late 19th century occult people, basically the same thing.
Yeah,
But there's some difference between Golden Dawn and Theosophy and these groups. Could you just go into some of those
right.
differences and say where a figure like Yeats would maybe fit in?
Okay, so to go on this definition and then come back eventually to
Yes.
Yeats and Blake. Okay, so Yeats was a member of both at slightly different times, but Theosophy was a religion and spiritual group founded by the Ukrainian mystic H.P. Blavatsky, also Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, also Madame Blavatsky, depending on, depending on what she called herself. She wrote several like 1,000-page long mystic tracts, which are like a fusion of Western occultism and Eastern spiritual traditions. She is quite contentious because of her like alleged supposed um, appropriation of the spiritualities of people of color. Um, it's like a can of worms to open that up. But basically, Blavatsky brought together many different spiritual traditions into theosophy, and it was, they had very strict, like, kind of, they had very strict rules about, so no mediumship, no kind of contacting spirits because you'll bring in evil spirits, for example, which is why someone like George Russell was very anti-spirit medium stuff, whereas
Okay.
Yeats adored it and was fascinated through his whole life. Blavatsky and Yeats did not get on, and they had a disagreement when Yeats was part of the Theosophical. So within the Theosophical Society at the time, Yeats and Russell were members. There was something within it called I think the Hermetic group or something, which was more like an occult reading group within Theosophy at this specific time. Again, dates maybe not quite there, but I describe it in my book. And also Peter Koch's book Yeats and AE is an excellent kind of introduction to how these two groups work in Yeats's circle. Golden Dawn is much more structured, and it's a secret society, and it was founded by several former Freemasons, or some of them were Freemasons at the same time. So the structure of it, you have 10 grades and you advance through the grades and you learn more and more occult stuff. So more kind of secret, interesting
Video
material
game
is revealed.
Logic.
Yeah, exactly. You level up through. And the thing is about those levels is the top 3 levels aren't actually for people, because they're spiritual, so you have to be like a spirit to be there. So nobody gets up there. At level 5, you reach the inner order, so you can't actually practice occult magic until you get to level 5. It's all theoretical until that point, and a lot of people who wanted to kind of dabble in cool secret society stuff didn't actually get to practice magic because they kind of got up to level
3,
1 and
level
2,
4.
and they were like, oh, this
Not
sucks
enough.
and then they just don't go. But Yeats got into the inner order, George Yeats got into the inner order. Pamela Coleman Smith, I can't, to my memory, I think she didn't actually get into the inner order. She was a artist who was most famous for the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck, which she created with another Golden Dawn member, Arthur Edward Waite, A.E. Waite. So Golden Dawn, Secret Society, lots of levels. They studied all sorts of things, from alchemy to John Dee's angel magic to tarot correspondences, tarot cards. One of their tasks for their levels and their examination, they had exams to pass to get to the next levels. It's a very nerdy society. And so one of the tasks was make your own tarot deck. So
do we have Yeats's tarot deck?
Yes,
wow.
Yes. In the National Library of Ireland, there are his cards and his magical implements. So his magical tools that he has designed and coloured and painted himself, which is another task to do. It's very crafty, very nerdy. It's very involved, and unfortunately, there were lots of arguments about how things should be done. The leadership was quite autocratic. The Mathers family, so Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, who kind of appropriated the MacGregor to kind of pretend he was Scottish nobility to give him more kind of authority. And then Mona Mathers, she is actually the sister of the French philosopher Henry Bergson. So her name was Mona Bergson before she married him. And they split their time between London and Paris, which is another way that the group eventually fractured because they were traveling all the time. And then
did Bergson ever visit the Golden Dawn? Sorry, I'm just that's a curious.
I don't
connection.
know. I haven't looked it up. You got me interested in that, but no, I don't know. It might be written somewhere, but I don't know.
So the Golden Dawn starts not necessarily with this charismatic Blavatsky style leader, but gradually it gets one.
Yes, or rather, there were 3 people who founded it, and then of the 3, one guy, Mathers, eventually became again a charismatic autocratic leader. Yeah, so both of them are groups in people in those groups there was some crossover. They have vaguely, like kind of broadly similar interests. Yeats was a member of both, but again, he kind of firmly committed himself to the Golden Dawn, and he is to this day probably one of the most famous members of that society.
Are they still going?
Along, yeah. Ah, so that's a
Well, it's a
contentious
secret.
topic.
Yeah.
It is a secret. There are lots of people there are lots of organizations with the name the Golden Dawn. I cannot confirm or deny that they like exist, and but I have never been a member. It's not my thing at all. I'm very like Blake. I'm very anti joining like occult groups. So I'd rather kind of do my own thing and have like creative freedom and spiritual freedom in that way. Yeah.
That's an
No,
interesting point.
so
But
yeah,
just before jumping into the real meat, the Yates
yeah.
stuff, I mean, is it just that he was so independent that Blake did not become a cult leader? If people had just gathered
Colleen.
to him and thought, you know, this stuff is good, because he did wish to be more popular than he was. If it had really kicked off and they were like, Blake, tell us more, and he was on the hill, do you think he would have molded into that role, or he just would have found a way to alienate his newfound people? Is he just the
Right.
wrong guy for it?
So he did actually have a small cult following in his old age by a group of much younger artists. I can't remember. They had like a nickname, but it was led by an artist called Samuel Palmer. I think they were called like oh, I can't remember what they were called, but Blake gathered like this
Like
small group of like
Samuel
much
Palmer,
younger
like
artists.
weird mushrooms pictures. Samuel Palmer, like
I
weird
can't
paintings
remember.
of like mushroom landscapes. I mean, it's a common name, but there's a
Yeah,
really
no,
great painter called Samuel Palmer.
I honestly
Yeah,
I can't remember.
we'll
This is something I'm pulling out of
we'll
like
post
my
a link.
reading. Yeah, I can look it up myself and I will kind of post more links. But there's a really good YouTube lecture on this group by like a Blake scholar and artist. Again, I will send the link when I remember it when I find it because I attended that as like an evening like Zoom
Hmm.
call, so I remember it. Um, Blake was sort of involved in the Swedenborg Society. Again, he didn't have any authority in it. He joined it with Dorothy Gott. They were in the same meeting together. Him and Catherine attended it. We don't really have any record of what they thought about it or what they talked about. But again, they weren't like an authority. They were just kind of there. Blake's posthumous reception is really interesting in that there are some Blake groups who almost treat Blake like a prophetic figure who kind of lionize him. So like there's some like there's I think they call it the Fellowship of William Blake or something. There's a group at the moment, and I may be completely kind of misinterpreting their goals, but they kind of very much follow like Blake's example and try to do good in the world based on like Blake's example. Again, I could be like I invite these people if they watch this and think Jodie's being completely wrong to kind of challenge me on that. But yeah, a lot of kind of you go to like Blake events, like say Blake's grave unveiling, for example, in 2018, or like gathering round Blake's grave on the anniversary of his death. There's lots of kind of poetic readings to Blake's grave of Blake's works. It starts to feel a little bit like not a
Hmm.
cult, but it feels reverential in a kind of way that he would himself criticize, that he would perhaps not be comfortable. And again, William Blake has not appeared to me to tell me this. Like I haven't had a vision of Blake saying this is weird, stop it.
Ah.
But like that from reading him, I'm not sure how comfortable he would be with that. But then like I'm not sure how comfortable anyone would be with that, with having a cult after their death. I mean, someone like Mathers might, someone like Crowley might, but it really depends.
That Hitler
And
guy.
it's not a cult. Oh no, not go into that. Oh my
Yeah.
God.
What
Yeah.
happened to the that old age cult that existed just before he died? Was he aware of it? Did he interact with them? Did he shoo them away with
Like, and no, I
his
think he was
rod?
quite I think he was quite grateful for the company, honestly, in the conversation. So like they just sat and they chatted and like and they were key kind of figures immediately after his death in like keeping his legacy and his like artistic influence alive. Yeah, so they helped in that way. But it was not really a cult, more than like a group of enthusiastic people. That's what like so
Fan
many
club.
of these, yeah, fan clubs, like all the like Blake societies I was talking about, the Blake groups today, they are like enthusiasts of Blake. They are not cults. Like a cult is something that is difficult and dangerous and lots of other things that these societies are not. They are groups of enthusiasts who love and genuinely want to promote what they admire and what they're enthusiastic about. It might seem a bit strange to kind of venerate like a dead poet to that degree, but you know, they love it and they enjoy it and they're not doing harm. So yeah.
Yeah. Should try and just wind back? There was an interruption on the
Yeah.
big Yeats Golden
The big
Dawn.
Yates reveal.
Yates, the big Yates
Yeah.
reveal.
No, okay. So
Symbolism.
to
Invented his own
wind,
symbols.
oh
Golden
gosh,
Dawn. Yeah.
wind back the golden thread there.
Yeah.
So I think with Blake, he created a mythology as he went along. He had certain figures that would stand. So, like Loss, for example, the Eternal Prophet, he is like a creative, visionary person. Someone like Urizen, he stands for like he stands for kind of like trying to regulate to kind of contain vision, which goes very badly and wrongly in kind of many Blake poems. But there are, you know, there are really interesting reassessments of Urizen coming along now that like actually he is not like this restrictive authoritarian figure that he's been so often interpreted to be. So someone like S. Yarbury has done some excellent like recent articles on Urizen. A friend of mine, Anise Rogers, feels very strongly that Urizen is actually like a more of like a lost figure than Loss is. And then again, someone like Orc, who is again considered a prophetic figure, represents like visionary fire and like sensuality, sexuality. I and like other scholars like who I admire, like Lucy Kogan, kind of refute that because of like the harm Orc like causes to women, like his sexual assault of women, his abuse of women, like it kind of problematizes this like free love thing in Blake, this kind of so you could this free love in Blake, this kind of freedom, like freedom, but at whose expense,
Yeah,
really?
Blake is frequently
Yeah,
offered like big harems of women in various poems. In Vision of the Daughters, I
yeah,
think once in
yeah,
Jerusalem as well. Yeah.
yeah. So like there is a way to problematize that. So like Blake has people I don't like to say deities, but definitely kind of spiritual beings because they're not quite lost in Urizen. They're not quite human. They're kind of like the like a classical like Greco-Roman pantheon in that they behave in very human ways. They have
Yeah.
affairs. They make mistakes. They do stupid things sometimes. So they're not quite godly. They're not quite human either. But a lot of people like, will interpret them as human. But yeah, they each have kind of like things that certain like expressions of energies that they are aligned with. But again, it changes across Blake's work and it fluctuates. One, I think Yeats's interpretation there is a way to try and validate
Mhm.
Blake by putting him into a system. We're saying there is a system here. This is not madness. This is like organized thought
Yeah.
expressed by symbolic figures. That is very much Yeats's. That is a consistent like interpretation of Yeats across like his life and his writing. You see it in A Vision as well when he writes about Blake in Phase
Mhm.
16 because he assigned again like Yeats loves systems, occult systems, categorizing things. Very different brain to Blake's, even though he was heavily influenced by Blake. Um, and you see that both in like his literary criticism, his art criticism on Blake, as well as his own like mystic tracts. Yeah, he's a lot more consistent than Blake in his like symbolism. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting to bring up consistency
Mm.
and contiguity, because this is something I spoke to Mark Vernon about briefly, about the sort of Blake project. And Vernon was of
Mm.
the opinion that it's in a way maybe a straight or slightly wavy line, but towards one end, and that all things are developing towards this end. Whereas I have the view, not an original view, but that Blake
Mm.
did change his mind enormously after the French Revolution, and then after its failure, changed it back. But I think the Lambeth prophecies, where Orc is introduced, and
Mm.
it's more about worldly revolution and worldly redemption, was a
Mm.
change to his earlier point of view. And then after the French Revolution began to sort of disintegrate, which is represented in the Book of Ahania, I think, with Fuzon, this revolutionary figure who declares he is God. And
Mm.
it's interesting that Fuzon is not Orc. And I think what you say
Mm.
about Orc is valid, particularly for a contemporary reader. But my impression is for Blake, Orc is a positive, violent, fearsome, and horrible in certain ways, but a figure of positive change. Whereas Vernon's view, the contiguous view, is that Orc is equal to Urizen as a kind of cautionary tale against revolution, against
Yeah,
blood-fueled violence. So do you think there is, the claim can be made that Blake went back and forth? Is Orc a positive figure who then in Jerusalem, or Milton, the chain of jealousy, no longer interested in Orc, but was at some point almost the protagonist, whereas Loss had
yeah,
a much smaller role?
that is really a really interesting like take there. Like I am not familiar with like Mark Vernon's book. I'm with his overall like argument. Like I know of it, but I've not read his book yet, so I don't want to speak too much for him or on him without being informed. But I will say that like Orc meant a lot to Blake, particularly in America. And in part, that is like Blake's own kind of, internal biases. As like a man, he's a man who wrote this. Like, his strongest prophetic figures, his most like iconic prophetic figures will be men because that's how he kind of self-identified. You see someone like Lucy Cogan will like say Blake identified himself most with loss. I say like equally, like you could bounce between loss and orc. And like as his work matures, like Valor for Zoas, they're two titles for one epic work, and then Milton and then Jerusalem revisit this creation story, the kind of interconnection of these figures again and again, telling similar stories but from slightly different angles, kind of revising his own mythology and in a way, yeah, systemizing and organizing it a bit. But you see, like as you said, Orc gradually kind of decreasing in like importance and even in force as the works kind of go on. At least that's how I read it. But yeah, I mean, Orc was really important to Blake at a certain point in his like career, and Orc is not without major issues when you read him from a contemporary lens. And as I read him as like a woman myself, of course I'm bringing that lens. This is, of course, all the most of the critics who criticize Orc are also women, so naturally they'd read Orc that way. um but no, that there is a development, and you see like almost like the rise and fall of certain figures. Someone like Athene, for example, is a very strong like heroine in Visions of the Daughter of Albion, but she is treated quite dismissively in the later Blake works. So again, like it's more an evolution. It's him kind of sitting with his universe and reconfiguring it as he ages, as he experiences different changes in like his life and the world around him. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you in like the broadest sense there. Yeah.
Um,
And you
go.
mentioned very early, just on this same thread,
Mm.
kind of Dante and the visionary qualities of Dante, but
Mm.
also that he brings in much of his contemporary time, both with names and sort of certain political
Mm.
struggles. And this is
Mm.
something you get unambiguously in Blake in a way, in that you have like Handhile, Hoban, Schofield, these personal enemies who become
Yeah.
representatives of certain aspects of evil, the sons of Albion and so on, which could be extrapolated as a sort of personal visionary representation. But what do you think? And this is especially evident in the Lambeth prophecies, as it's obvious, it's in the text, but of the political suggestions in the later works, that it could be again, an idea Vernon disagrees with, but allegorical significance given the Napoleonic Wars, given Blake's strong
Mm.
feelings on and against Napoleon in the cosmic struggle. Because I think Jack and I were speaking recently about a certain quality of biblical prophecy, is that it was related very much to the events of the time that people would
Mm.
implicitly recognize. They'd know these places, these names, they know what's being alluded to,
Especially in Revelation, which has just
especially in
subsequently
Revelation.
become bonkers, meaningless, surreal numbers and objects, but presumably to the audience at the time meant specific political entities, specific geographical locations, and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Um,
you pick up on all of that as the contemporary reader, and then filtered through three translations of people who are more and more distant from the source, becomes more generally symbolic. And we can
Yeah.
imagine that Milton is adopting the prophetic mode already. So he's already writing in a way that seems maybe a little bit abstract. But then upon that as well, he's adding his own contemporary references, which we, as contemporary readers of now, are misinterpreting or missing, which makes it seem even more abstract. Is it possible, really, that some of these later ones, especially, contain quite a lot of things? Like, I mean, he talks about Tibbins Brook, which is where people would be hanged. But if you didn't know that, Tibbins Brook becomes another of those strange, like, what could it mean? Is this etymological? Is this kind of something else? Or, in fact, is Blake attempting to create a completely, truly prophetic idea? And he's not muddying it with what's happening in Europe, what's happening with certain prime ministers or politicians.
So like I think it's really important, like there is really important and key like historical and political context in Blake's works. I think like the extent to which it appears in his works really depends. So like Jerusalem, for example, the group of mystics who guard the gate. So you've got Teresa of Avila, you've got Madame Guyon, who was a French mystic who was also like brothers who was imprisoned. And you've got
mm.
um, in Jerusalem as well, you've got the Methodists, you've got Wesley, and the other man whose name I have forgotten, but he misspells
Whitefield,
Wesley. Yes, yes.
yeah.
Whitefield and Wesley. He misspells Wesley as Wesley, but it is Wesley. And so there are real people in Jerusalem who appear in the tumult of prophetic like activity in the events. I think like a lot of Blake's contemporaries, like brothers, for example, like face like legal and political consequences for putting real people in their prophetic works. So sometimes Blake is kind of masking, like shielding some of those realities in a way to kind of protect himself. It comes across as something kind of very creative and interesting, but there is this kind of self-guarding thing just in case something happens to him, which like he got in trouble with the law a little bit later about like a assault in Felpham, as you all know. But he he definitely engages with like real politics of religion and everything. So like when I was trying to like look at does Blake use the word mystic, there's a cancelled play for America, and he talks about George the Third and the throne room. So he has a throne room and he has mystic instruments to
Mm.
capture and bring forth like daemonic like entities, and that's a plate that wasn't included.
Mm.
But when you do like a search of, so I did like a search of complete works of William Blake, like the Erdmann edition, the Erdmann text online, which includes cancelled texts and things. And this wedding, like, wow, okay, so he is calling like George III like a demon conjurer here, allegedly. Like that is huge, and that is something that he cut. And again, that would make it like, oh, okay, so Orc isn't just here running around proclaiming like free love, revolution. He is also responding to
The
a
demon conjuring
monarch.
king.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So it's a really important aspect of Blake's work, but again, he self-censors sometimes, or he will just like
Mm.
make things different because of the creative process. It
Yeah.
really depends poem to poem. But
Yeah.
It's an
absolutely, it's really
interesting
important.
I
idea.
like the idea of him just
Just
going, no, that's probably not true, actually.
Yeah.
just self-censoring. All the things he'll say, but that's too far. I couldn't. I
Well,
couldn't say that.
he does it on some of the plates as well. So the plate for the end of the Book of Fell, some of the images for it. So if you go onto the Blake archive, excellent resource for Blake. All his poems, illustrations,
Mm.
complete text up there. If you're into Blake, go to blakearchive.org. They've got everything. So they have like all the different plates, visual kind of pictures of them, and you can see certain lines in the Book of Fell scrubbed out and erased. And one of them, it's the line about genitalia. So it's the curb on the burning boy and like the shroud or like the curtain on
Mm.
the woman. And for whatever reason, Blake has kind of scrubbed that line out as if it's too like sexually explicit, as if like he didn't want like his patron didn't want to kind of
Mm.
buy it for that reason. So Blake censors for a lot of different reasons, both like political and otherwise. Also, to get people to buy his work to make it more like viable. Yeah, so it really depends. But yeah, it's important.
A similarity between you and Mark Vernon, Jodie, which is also a
All right.
similarity with King Charles, is that you have a common influence, namely the critic Kathleen Raine.
Oh,
Raine was spiritual advisor to the current king. Mark Vernon, during our interview, described her as being among the handful of people who actually understood Blake.
oh
Who
my
is
God.
Kathleen Raine? What's her status in Blake studies? What are some of her big ideas or arguments about Blake?
Oh, this is so interesting. I didn't know that about Kathleen Raine. I didn't know that about I presume
And
a
apparently,
really silly.
it was a very intimate relationship with the king. Like
So
he,
current king.
yeah, Charles.
Wow, okay. He's
There's a
quite
hilarious Mark Vernon article where he says Charles is the most Blakean king we've ever had, or something
The
like this.
Mystic Monarch. It's
The
called the
Mystic
Mystic Monarch.
Monarch is the name
okay.
of the article. We'll
I'm
send you
gonna
that.
look that. Yes, no, I'm fascinated by that. It turns out I will actually need to read Mark Vernon. Oh my gosh, no, that I'm just processing that because
Me and Milo
Kathleen
can talk among
Raine
ourselves while we do.
Kathleen Raine is so strange in Blake studies because so many Blake scholars have turned on her, and yet she has quite a popular reputation. So you'll find that people like so without kind of negating the labor and the research of people that write like popular Blake books, like non-academic Blake books,
Hmm.
they are much more likely to reference Kathleen Raine than academic studies do. I
Oh.
think Kathleen Raine is considered both kind of passe and complicated by a lot of Blake scholars because she adheres to a very Yeatsian way of interpreting Blake, which is Blake adheres to these specific traditions. There is a definite structure to his work. She's very into reading Blake through a Neoplatonic lens of like the Eleusinian mysteries, and spell, for example, is like an initiation
Hmm.
thing. Um, and she did a lot of good work on Blake and Swedenborg and finding specific. So, from my opinion, yeah, good Blake and Swedenborg work. She wrote about Burma as well, of course, and the occult. And Blake and specific traditions there. She's also referenced Blake and Agrippa, which is another like interesting influence that is there in Blake, but not a lot of people talk about. So Agrippa is like a key major occult figure from I can't remember when, but yeah, he's been like important since forever. An unscholarly way of phrasing that, but like I'm trying to remember. Was trying to remember
Yeah.
when he was born, and I couldn't.
The past.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
It's is
several centuries ago.
I
Yeah,
think Agrippa one of the books in Frankenstein towards the beginning when
yeah,
one
yeah.
of these faulty books that the professor's like, why are you reading this trash? And then he creates
Yeah,
life.
I had to reread that recently because I reviewed the new Frankenstein film. So I was like, well, I better read the book for the first time in however many years. And I did, and like, oh, this holds up. This is fantastic. won't talk about Frankenstein now, but
Though we could, but yeah,
yeah.
no,
There's time.
we still
No,
got to
we've
we
done
still got to
enough.
get to
We've done
Sharp and McLeod at some point.
enough. We've done enough. We've done enough. It's side quests on this. So Rain, very, very like systemic approach to Blake, which has been kind of derided because she says that Yeats is one of the only people to understand Blake, which is so interesting because Mark Vernon says Rain is one of the only
Yeah.
interests. So it's like a chain. It's a chain of people influencing each other.
Maybe we
kind
should
of
say
whether
that Mark
sufficiently or
Vernon is the
not.
only person to understand Blake, and it's just an never ending. And then time circles at the end, and Blake says that the person before, and then it's just a loop.
Yeah, or then this Blake appears and he's like, I don't like any of you. Like, what are you doing? You're all wrong. Like,
Yeah.
no, Kathleen Raine, yeah, so that's to summarize her approach. She wrote both popular as well as scholarly books on Blake. She wrote like a popular art history book on Blake in like the 70s or 80s that my friends just had in his house, just around. And I'm like, oh, you got an art history book on Blake by Kathleen Raine. Like, so she wrote like general stuff as well. She's one of the first people as well to connect the new age, as in like the 60s and 70s, with Blake as it was happening, because it took Blake scholars about a decade or so to kind of catch up to that. But she was one of the first people to acknowledge that. So she was very unique in her approach. I love her work, but I do find fault with it. I think she was also one of the first people to say, so to my knowledge, it's just me and Kathleen Raine who say that Yeats and Ellis's 3-volume 1893 study of Blake directly influenced how Yeats structured a vision. So his Blake literary criticism directly informed his mystic tract, which supposedly has nothing to do with literary criticism, even though he cites poetry and poets all the way through it. Yeah.
Yeah, one comment I remember Vernon making just on Kathleen Raine is that if you gave her any line from, say, Jerusalem, she could give you a sort of exegesis, which seems to kind of jive with what you're talking about, that you can almost kind of annotate the whole thing, find specific like triple meaning in each line, and the whole thing is this kind of network, this web of meaning. That's often not my take on Jerusalem. A lot of the lines, when it starts listing the places, I sort of like, okay, I don't know what that one's going to mean, but I can see this being a kind of diagnostic approach of every word is precious, every word contains fivefold, sixfold meaning. Use Blake's language.
Yeah, Kathleen Raine, of course, besides her Blake criticism, was a poet. She was also like involved in spiritual groups. So she founded the Tenemus Academy. So she has kind of a link to contemporary or contemporaneous spiritual cultures of her time, kind of like how similar to but different from Yeats's involvement in Theosophy and the Golden Dawn. So she is kind of a Yeatsian figure in herself, whilst having her own distinct takes on Blake. Yeah. I think her work is really undervalued, which is why I'm so fascinated. So fascinated when Mark Vernon and then people like Philip Hoare's book on William Blake and the Sea Monsters of Love refers to Rain quite often, which again I found interesting because that's like a Blake book that is non-academic, and Philip Hoare told me that himself. He said this is not an academic book. And I also because I read that because I was reviewing it for an academic journal, and so he did an interview with the Blake Society, which is on YouTube, and the Q&A section in which I ask him a question is also recorded, and I'm one of the first people to ask a question because as soon as he finished talking, I was like, I need to ask you things. And I asked him, this book is almost as if like William Blake like possessed you and possessed the book. Would you like kind of, could you compare that to like the process of writing it? And then he was like, yeah. And like it was very simple and very blunt, and it was like, so William Blake possessed you when you were writing this book? Yeah. Okay. Didn't really have any answer to that. But no, the most interesting works on Blake are sometimes the non-academic ones because they're kind of free of this solid history of Blake studies. Yeah. and
Yeah.
of expectation. Yeah.
Yeah, could we pivot now to William Sharp, Fiona MacLeod? So,
Yes.
on the subject of possession, actually, by
Mm.
a sort of force. So, obscure writer from late 19th, early 20th century in this kind of
Yes.
Celtic mystic group. With most
Hmm.
people who write under a pen name, the pen name is often quite simple. You know, George Orwell just sounds better than Eric Blair, or
Mm.
and the personality of George Orwell and the personality of Eric Blair seem to be one. Even in
Mm.
someone like Kierkegaard, who's writing under loads of different pseudonyms who say radically contradictory things, we still get the sense that it's just one person experimenting with several different voices. With
Mm.
Sharp and MacLeod, though, we have this interesting phenomenon of someone almost being the prophetic utterance mouthpiece for their pen name,
Yeah.
almost like the prophets in Delphi being possessed by Apollo, or indeed Dorothea Gott being
Yeah.
possessed by the Holy Ghost. And again, with
Mm.
the male going into female, female going into male.
Mm.
So yeah, William Sharp at some point starts writing under this name, Fiona MacLeod. Could you just talk a
Mm.
little bit to the start about what Sharp's relationship was with this name and this whole
Yes.
personhood that came with it?
Okay, so this is quite complicated. It gets into lots of kind of contention within Victorian studies, but Sharp always felt from his youth that he had a feminine aspect to himself that lived inside himself, and that was directly connected to spiritual experience, to dream visions, to creativity. So you see that in his letters to his wife, Elizabeth Sharp, in Elizabeth Sharp's memoir. Um, and she is quite open about that as well. Like, my husband believed he had like a feminine aspect to himself that was crucial to his creativity and his creative development. So when you get into like academic studies, it gets quite contentious because no, there's some quite unpleasant like assumptions about Sharp's sexuality and Sharp's gender. But to break it right down, Fiona MacLeod was a way of Sharp expressing himself in words, in thoughts, in letters as well. He maintained correspondence both as Sharp and as MacLeod. They had separate literary friendships and relationships and interests. All
And
the letters, by the way, are like open access via like Cambridge Open Access editions. But in terms of creativity, yeah, MacLeod was a way to directly kind of channel and express that creativity in a way, for whatever reason, Sharp could not. You find in the 1880s and 1890s, their writing styles are very similar, different names, but their writing styles are similar. And then that evolves, and MacLeod kind of finds her own kind of voice, as it were. So it's complicated, but essentially like a, a way to articulate Sharp, a way for Sharp to articulate himself in a way he couldn't as himself,
hmm.
which you can interpret in many different ways.
And was MacLeod ever, as well as being this liberating creative presence, was it ever
Mm.
a burdensome presence? I mean,
Yeah.
the very idea of plurality of soul is kind of
Mm.
bound up with demon possession. I mean, even when Jesus
Mm.
asks the demon possessed man, "What is your name?" he says, "We, firstly, are legion." So
Mm.
it's a colonization of one's own soul, an oppressive force marking sort of stamping its foot into your personality and pushing you down, the authentic you. But is there any of this in the Sharp MacLeod relationship, or is it just purely this positive presence?
So, from a practical perspective, Sharp found it exhausting to exist as two authors, to put out two different workloads, and to also hide that MacLeod was him. He found it very difficult to balance those. And it was a very imbalanced relationship in that, like, he had a lot of health conditions as well that he exacerbated by taking on two workloads, two people, two creative outputs. It was a drain on him, and it was a drain on both of them. So it was draining to Sharp to be MacLeod. It was draining for Sharp for MacLeod to switch back to Sharp. There is just, in his own and in his wife's writing about it, it's just that the impression is exhaustion, complete kind of like physical and spiritual and creative exhaustion. The Sharps had like financial problems throughout their life, so there was really this impetus to keep kind of writing, and MacLeod made more money and was more successful. So there was like this need to perform as both, because Sharp, of course, had the critical reputation. He was very well connected to he knew the Rossettis. He was friends with the Rossettis. He was friends with various kind of Shelley and Blake scholars. Richard Garnett was a friend of his. John P. Nichol, the Glasgow professor of American and English literature, he was also friends with him. William Bell Scott, who, like, one of my current projects is about the Scott family, he was friends with them. Scott was friends with the Pre-Raphaelites. So Sharp has this gravitas and all these connections, and MacLeod has this spark of creativity that is very, like, that for whatever reason took off in a way that Sharp's own work didn't. But it was, for whatever creative work we have from both of them, it was incredibly draining and difficult to produce. And many people believe that it did contribute to Sharp's untimely death, age like 50. Yeah, because he had heart trouble. He had other things as well.
The set text that you gave us from Sharp / MacLeod was the passing of Lilith from the book Vistas. Really fantastic, batshit, underrated bit of like swivel eyes, mystical fin de siècle excess. But a difficult task, but do you fancy having a go at summarizing the passing of Lilith? What is this thing?
Right.
And maybe talk a bit about the collection it comes from.
Yeah, so Vistas is one of the transition kind of era texts of Sharp and MacLeod's, in that it was around the time that Sharp was about to publish as MacLeod. So it's on the precipice. So he's already thinking about like the feminine ability to channel spirits and to prophesize, and also like all the complications that comes with as like a woman. He wrote very sensitively about like the feminine experience, and was involved with like what we would call now like feminist movements of the late 19th century. He was very personally kind of involved in them, and was friends with a number of kind of people in that circle. But it's fascinating because he has this figure who he calls Lilith, who he names after like a villain in the Bible, and in like,
she's not in the Bible, but
not in the Bible, sorry. In
extracurricular Jewish texts.
So she is this like distinctly like negative figure, and turns her into this this prophet of her own doom, very much in the way that kind of Blake's female prophets prophesize their own doom, the way God does, which is why like I'm so drawn to it, which is why I also think it's like one of the most like Blakean of Sharp's texts, because people kind of split and rupture with like spiritual vision. And basically Lilith kind of gets tempted by like this male kind of figure. She has a watery vision at the start of a woman, and it turns out to be a vision of herself, like kind of leaving at the end of the poem, of kind of sinking into water and drowning and whatever happens. Like, it's kind of unclear, but you know, she has a watery demise, and she begets two different like races of children who are kind of non-human, and the more evil ones come from the man, and the less evil feminine ones come from her. So it's almost like biblical, but in its scope and its kind of language, but it's also distinctly like Blakean in its use of gender and rupture and fragmentation. And it is also wholly kind of connected to Sharp's and MacLeod's interests of having women as prophets, women as main characters. And it's technically not a MacLeod work, it's a Sharp work, which is why I found it so interesting, because it's so aligned to MacLeod's work, but not under her name.
Yeah, and it sort of takes place just before Genesis 2. So the end is set up for Paradise Lost, Genesis 2, the garden
Yeah.
story we all know, and it's as you said, written in this sort of almost pastiche KJV style language, and it's
Yeah.
written as a script as well. So the majority of the text is stage directions rather than speech,
Yeah.
not directions which are easy to stage. Some examples include she goeth by the starlit ways where the night flowers exhale exquisite odours that are as dreams. Another one I enjoy. As the shadow spirit goeth, the wild birds of Eden hover above him, and under his feet red and white flowers spring, and a low music followeth his steps. Do we know what this script form in particular offered? Why not poetry? Why not prose?
I'm not sure. I can't find much. Like, there's not a lot of scholarship on like specific Sharp and MacLeod works. You really have to read like the correspondence to work out kind of where they fit, mostly because there's so little. And most of the criticism that's about focuses on the poetry. But like a lot of people in the Celtic Twilight, because of the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, and because of like the importance of theatre to figures like Yeats, like they were writing plays. Like George Russell wrote plays. Yeats, of course, wrote plays. So I can only think that like Sharp McCloud was experimenting with form. It's also like it reminds me of some of like Byron's drama as well. I'm not a
Yeah,
Byron like, expert at all, but like it's a similar way of telling a story. And Sharp was a romanticist as well, so that might be it. But
yeah,
I don't know why, and I'm not even sure. Again, I'm trying to imagine how you would stage that. Like you say Scarlet
yeah.
Way, and I'm like, oh, that's easy. You would put some fairy lights up, but it's like, oh, they didn't have fairy lights back
Yeah,
then.
the
So
flowers
how would you do
sprouting from
flowers
the
spinning?
stage. You need a flower guy under the stage
Yeah.
pushing them
Like
up.
a trap door, like yeah. Oh,
Yeah, and you
oh
need to
man.
know that the odors of the flowers are as dreams. You need to get that across to
Yeah,
the audience.
pump
Oh,
it in. The dream
yeah,
odor.
yeah, no, like a smell-o-vision from the 50s. You would just like
Yes,
waft
Yeah.
something
that was
into the
Sharp's
audience.
greatest innovation was smell-o-vision.
Well, I
It's
don't
it
know. I'd have to look into that.
Yeah, he
so
said
it
that.
reminds me of well, just Paradise Lost originally was going to be a drama, stage drama, ended up morphing into this large poem, not always for reasons known. I think one of the reasons given was that stage drama could not have nudity in it, and nudity was
Okay.
very
Mm,
crucial to the Genesis narrative. Obviously, maybe Milton's drama would have been built to be staged for real. Then you get these like lyrical dramas, like more of the romantic poets. And I've read a couple of
yeah,
Shelley's plays.
Prometheus
I mean, Prometheus
Unbound.
Unbound, put that
Yeah,
on,
yeah,
give that a go.
yeah,
But it is interesting that Shelley and Byron and these people would decide to go for a kind of speculative theatrical form to basically,
Mm,
because usually the script is not the thing, the script points to the thing. But maybe
mm,
it was, the way Shakespeare ends up being taken in two ways. There's the kind of party, maybe even the larger party, who think Shakespeare is better on the page, interesting in the theatre, but you must always lose something. Every stage Shakespeare loses something of that kind of a page bound perfection. So maybe it's sort of there's something in the play script that
mm.
does something different to poetry, different to sort of prose. Maybe
Yeah.
it's better for the moving narrative. This is all speculation, but I am curious where the idea of the sort of imperfect form, let's create the
Mm.
instruction manual for a cabinet we will never build, but what a cabinet this would be. And it's like an IKEA thing with all the screws, and it's just we don't have any wood made of pure silver. But
Yeah, I mean,
hey, this is a nice
I,
document.
I mean, I may well like There may well have been attempts to stage it. I just don't know. I would need to look into
Yeah.
it. I'm doing like I have a current project on like MacLeod at the moment, which is more general kind of MacLeod as a romanticist like critic. But again, there may well be productions we don't know about, productions that perhaps I may have missed in my MacLeod mysticism like blinkers. But I
Mm.
think like one way you could use this form is it invites vision, it invites a visual spectacle. So like the play, you could adapt it into like a vision of sorts. Like you
Yeah.
could interpret the flowers, make them spring up. You could maybe have some kind of puppetry and have them come up. It's like,
Mm.
okay, here's the raw material for a vision. How would you envision the vision in like a physical form?
Sharp describes it as a vision in the letter. I think I'm just quoting here. In the spring of
Mm,
1886, during recovery from a long and nearly fatal illness, Lilith came to
mm,
me as a vision and was
yeah,
withheld in words as soon as I could put pen to paper.
yeah.
One of the things it reminded me the most of, I'm not sure if you've read it, is Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
I've not
Both,
read it.
yeah, so both works are written as threshold experiences for the
Mm,
writers after a period of extreme, almost fatal illness. Both fundamentally sort of transform the writers' lives as writers, as artists.
mm,
Zarathustra much longer. They both use pastiche, antique, pseudo-biblical verb forms, goeth, he doeth. Both contain
mm,
these symbolic archetypal characters. The timbre of the character's speech are also very similar. Thou art a
mm,
dream that is undreamed could come from Zarathustra, I think.
mm.
Give us life that we may triumph over this beautiful evil which hath no soul but who is yet immortal. Could easily be Nietzsche somewhere or other. And they're contemporary as well. They're like Zarathustra published in its entirety just 1 year before Vistas,
Mm.
and published earlier in volumes, like taking in the period where
Yeah,
Sharp's writing. Again, he would need
he
to
may
have lots of contact with Germany. Yeats only discovers Nietzsche much later, I think in 1902, I think.
he does, but then Nietzsche becomes a key influence on particularly the second edition of A Vision, 1937 one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it may well be that Sharp was influenced by that, but again, that is something that I have not got a lot of familiarity with. Like my main kind of goal was this is a key aspect of Blake's reception, and
Mm.
also Sharp MacLeod is massively underrated in literary studies as a fascinating figure who was really kind of well connected and is mostly just remembered for being a bit strange because of the two name two
Yeah.
personality thing.
But it's just a joy to read. Could I
Mm.
quote another passage? I mean,
Yeah.
hand in hand they go forth together, and the innermost flower of flowers rejoiceth, and each blade of grass bendeth as with a wind, and throughout Eden there is a sound as of the laughter of life. And while the moon prevaileth, Uluel, the fairest of the sons of God, and Lilith lie among the lilies of the valley, where the spray of the fountains cools the air, and the shadows are deep from the great boughs of ancient trees. The joy that is their joy passeth knowledge, for mortality is swallowed up in immortality, as the stars that perish lie in the heart of the firmament, and Uluel, the Son of God, trembleth because of the unspeakable sin, and anon trembleth with the greatness of unspeakable joy, and Lilith dreameth.
That's incredible. Like that
Come
is
on!
just I know, like and people have the goal to say that Sharp wrote purple prose. Like that is beautiful. You can like connect that right back to like Revelation, to Blake, to like even like other kind of contemporaries of his. So like someone like Mathilde Blind, for example, also wrote very heavily influenced by Romanticism. Again, very similar visionary mode, but very
Yeah.
different.
And Nietzsche. I can't
Mm.
emphasize how similar lots of this stuff is to Zarathustra. Not to anything else Nietzsche ever
Yeah.
wrote, but Zarathustra is it's very similar. I just
Oh my gosh.
discovered late Yeats's letter that he sent to Lady Gregory on Boxing Day, just like I think
Mm.
a week or two after he's discovered Nietzsche.
Oh,
I have written to you little and badly of late. I am afraid, for the truth is you have a rival in Nietzsche, the strong enchanter. I have read him so much that I have made my eyes bad again. They were getting
oh
well, it
no.
seemed. Nietzsche completes Blake and has the same roots. I have not read anything with so much excitement since I got to love Morris's stories, which have the same curious, astringent joy.
Oh, yeah. Again, I don't really touch Nietzsche. I've
Yeah.
tried. Didn't finish Zarathustra. I started reading it around 2016, but yeah, clearly, like my homework is go finish that 10 years later, read Mark Vernon as well, and then like try and work out if any of this sharp stuff was staged because that idea is absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
I've got an idea with Sharp McCloud, just sort of tying back to Blake being an
Mm.
influence. Perhaps, I mean, I see in Lilith there's some of sort of the earlier Blake, the Book of Thel style,
Mm.
slightly less sort of like infinite words and strange meters, and a bit more
Yeah.
kind of measured and pastoral and
Yeah.
beautiful. But I wonder to the extent that Blake's own representations of gender may have influenced Sharp McCloud in the personal, because Blake's entire mythological universe is founded on this kind of gender idea. The
Mm.
hermaphroditic man is the ideal form, sort of all things coming into a kind of oneness. So necessarily
Mm.
the Godhead must contain male and female entirely, completely and
Mm.
sort of united. And often, the spectre and emanation, one is the masculine, one is the feminine. It's
Yeah.
all the way through the work. And then he introduces these strange and different concepts of the male females and the female males. And then there's the female will especially in the Mental
Yeah.
Traveler, which
Mm.
I mean you can explain what the hell's going on in that poem
Oh,
in addition,
no,
but
I
but
can't.
never mind. But yeah, I just wonder how Blake's sort of vision of gender, which does seem, in some respects, there are similarities, and I think there's many mystic traditions that ultimately have to end in oneness because they must. All things have to pend back to your sort of monotheistic ideal, therefore, kind of the triangle upside down.
Mm.
But I wonder if any express it quite in the way that Blake does.
I think the reason I was so keen to advocate for Sharp and MacLeod's inclusion in Blake's legacy in the 19th century is because I have seen no one else quite capture Blake's understanding of articulation of like gender and like gender as form system as the breaking down of forms and system. Nobody does it quite like Sharp and MacLeod do, and I think or since really I think that again with Blake it was something that evolved with his work, and I think he expanded on it more in his later thicker, more mythological, like kind of broad ranging works. But yeah, no, it's not done by anyone else. Sharp and McLeod, I've not found anyone else who does it quite like them. Yeah, or
But could it
understands
be,
it.
could we interpret it that the Blake vision of the universe maybe even influenced the way in which Sharp McCloud sort of self-reflected, saw themselves
Yes.
potentially. There's a
Yeah.
coexistence. It's not one pushes out the other, which is sort of your traditional, maybe when someone
Mm,
has a sort of preferred identity and that one comes in and the other one is discarded, even relatively
mm,
disliked. But here we've got two, and there is the sense when you were talking about competition, but
mm.
that they're compartments of maybe a singular form, and that's really the Blake notion that the male and the female are compartments of one thing, sort of
Yeah.
separating but pending towards one another ultimately.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Like I don't really I think I think if you were to like read one example of Sharp's like MacLeod's actually a description of their experience of gender and of two kind of gendered beings in one. It would be an 1890s letter to Yeats where Sharp and MacLeod's relationship is described, and he describes this to Yeats as like a torch to be lit and carried, in that I'm trying to quite remember which aspect was the flame and which was the torch, but I think Sharp was the torch, MacLeod lit and carried the flame, the creative inspiration of it. And it's really interesting that Sharp, one of the few people he told about this dual identity, this dual authorship, was Yeats, who was like an occultist and a Blakean who kind of understood like the gender binary and its kind of spiritual symbolism in older like alchemical works. So someone like Jacob Boehmer, for example, and other alchemists like personifying the knowledge of the alchemical quest as a woman called Sophia, which someone like Alan Moore then does with Sophie in Promethea. And I have a lot of kind of quibbles with that book. But again, it's a feminizing spiritual experience and like a whole tradition of that. So I think, yeah, the relationship there is one carries the other, one inspires the other. It is interrelated and interdependent for better or for worse. And that may well be because, say, Sharp living in the late 19th century, say, if he were to kind of be interpreted as a trans woman today, and I do believe that he is like I personally interpret him as like gender queer, as like not a straight man, but as like something beyond that. Um, it's one way that you can kind of describe like a fluid relationship between identities within oneself, is this beautiful kind of like flame metaphor. Yeah. I am flagging a bit. I'm sorry. I'm trying to like remember all my references.
Yes.
Now, I wonder, just going back to Blake then, who sort of had this idea, and maybe it goes back a very long way indeed, but what do we know about Blake's relationship with his wife, which may have
Ooh.
come into this, may have inspired this? I mean, what have we got there? Because she isn't mentioned as much as you'd think in the sort of popular. Blake is, I mean, we all like these sort of monolithic figures who come up with everything, and they are the funnel of God and so on. But as far as I understand it, there was something of a creative collaboration or a system between them.
Yeah.
And how exactly did this express itself?
So, from a practical perspective, they worked together at Blake's printing press. Catherine coloured some of the plates, some of the like illustrations. After Blake's death, she also had that role in like promoting Blake's creative work of like coloring it, painting it. So from a practical perspective, those are her contributions. They are kind of significant in terms of the labor behind Blake's work, which often gets forgotten. In terms of Catherine herself as an influence, she believed Blake's visions. She believed that what he saw. And I've had discussions with friends about, well, is Catherine then a visionary? Like that sometimes there's, so I believe it is the figure, the Eurasian figure with the compass and the globe from the start of Europe. Like I believe they both experienced that vision as like a group thing. And David Worrell writes about that in his new book, like William Blake's Visions, which is a very different take to mine about visions, kind of like a psychological way of like describing them. But they have like shared beliefs, they have shared spiritual values, and they have also like a practical working creative relationship. So Catherine is absolutely like key to Blake's creative process because it's another person to kind of share the creative like burden. It's very difficult to like operate as Blake did and create as Blake did like by himself. So, and she was his companion throughout his life, so probably offered like a lot of like emotional and intellectual support as well. So yeah, she's a really critical figure. Yeah.
She's kind of different to, you know, the daughters slash wife that Milton is dictating to, for example, where it is just
Mm.
pure, just like the only reason you're writing this is because I can't write because I am blind.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Yeah.
almost like a pure possession, actually, to bring everything back to possession. It's like
Okay.
it's pure John Milton going through her hand onto the page. It's not like
Mm.
there's some back and forth between
Mm.
between the poet and the between, you know, not a prophet, but yeah, a
Yeah.
visionary poetic writer and the scribe.
Well,
And
it's
it
a
seems this
shame.
is one of
Yeah.
well, it's one of Milton's sins in Milton, the Blake poem, is this way he dictated to, I
Mm.
mean, all along this bizarre kind of six-headed spirit creature. But it's one of
Oh dear,
his
yeah.
problems is the way he treats his combinatory wives and daughters, which one must imagine is contrary to the way Blake imagined he treats his wife. And again, there's that kind of curious little niggle where Oleron admits that she should have given other maidens to Milton that you see in the
Uh,
visions of Albion, and it's sort of like I wonder if this is something either Blake was really campaigning for in the household, or something that he
oh,
simply
maybe.
experienced.
Yeah,
I
there.
just why does it keep coming up? Why is it so
Uh,
crucial?
There is a critical, like there has been discussion in Blake criticism and Blake biography of early on in their marriage, like Blake allegedly wanted to open the marriage and it upset Catherine, so they allegedly did not do that. It's quite difficult to determine perhaps exact conversations they had, like what exactly they agreed and disagreed on from an artistic and philosophical perspective, because we simply don't have the documentation of it. Like we have references to Catherine's health and Blake's letters and things she does or says, but they're all really brief snippets. And because of like this lack of material on Catherine, this lack of Catherine's kind of voice necessarily like coming through like you know like I'm not saying that Blake like handed the pen to Catherine and let her write a verse of like Jerusalem or
Mhm.
anything. We don't know. I'm not saying that she did or did not do that, but if there was any kind of creative collaboration like that, there's no documentation to my knowledge of it. And because of just the assumptions of Blake criticism, which I think understand Catherine, particularly older Blake text, understand Catherine as this kind of Milton's wife and daughter's figure. I think that kind of limited her reception later on, which is still just now being explored more. Yeah, but no, we wouldn't have a lot of Blake's works without her, a lot of kind of prints of Blake's stuff without her. Yeah, or even Blake himself, because Blake was a very like depressed man, or without diagnosing him, he had a lot of kind of struggles with like sadness and melancholy and is my career, is my life kind of as it is worth pursuing. She was his companion throughout that. Like like she has an impact that we can't know because we weren't there at the time. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, so wind slowly towards the end
Mm.
now. We
You
ask
sound
it,
like a meditation.
yeah. Coming
As like
back
close your eyes, blah blah blah,
This has
throughout the
been a
day.
slowly,
Solomon and Smith's
open
meditation.
your lid.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, we're looking for ideas with the pentangles on our pentangle, ace, petangle, patingle on our side. It's all coming in. It's
Pentacle.
It's
Yeah,
pent.
hope
yeah,
so. Yeah.
Yeah. We ask
guaranteed. I
every
thought.
guest what book you'd add to the biblical canon. if every council is just going to approve it. What's going in there? What's going in
The biblical canon.
Yeah, I don't know why. It just sort of happened because our first two guests translated the Bible. But
So what would I add to the Bible?
yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's a very Blakean heretical thing to ask of me, but I'm not in the Catholic Church anymore, so
But it won't be
why not?
heretical, We'll get the
It'll be
councils to
orthodox,
approve it.
yeah.
It'll be orthodox, yeah.
All right. I would be very basic and Blakean and add the marriage of heaven and hell. I think it's a really interesting take on the Bible and biblical kind of characters, biblical writers, and I think it's one of my favorite Blakes. My favorite Blake, I like fluctuate between, but I think my favorite is Visions of the Daughter of Albion, but I think Marriage deserves a place in the biblical canon because it is also literally Proverbs from hell, the Bible from hell being bound by dragon creatures in caves. I think why not add that?
Yeah, getting the Bible and hell into the actual Bible as well. What a twist.
Yeah. Yes.
Interesting
yes,
sermons.
That's my choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Good exegesis. Great. Lovely speaking to you, Joey. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Perfect.
And we'll say
Wonderful
goodbye
meeting you.
performatively.
Bye.
Bye.
Farewell.